I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Steve, you want to go ahead and come on up here? Steve Grunwell from Columbus, Ohio, is going to be talking to us this morning. He works for a new startup called Growella, pardon me.
That's all right.
From what I gathered, really solid financial advice that people can understand and learn from. So working on a lot of really interesting projects. He's going to talk to us today about writing WP-CLI commands that actually work. So Steve, the time is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I am Steve Grunwell, and welcome to writing WP-CLI commands that work. If you'd like a copy of the slides to follow along at home, and I'll be tweeting these out later, but stevegrunwell.com/slides/WP-CLI. A little bit about me, as my clicker reconnects. I am the director of technology at Growella. Many of you probably haven't heard of Growella, but you may have heard of 10up. Up until November, I was a lead web engineer there. So there's your context. I'm an open source contributor, albeit a lot of that comes from using a lot of open source software, subsequently breaking a lot of open source software, going, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. Hey, that's not so bad. Hey, someone should really document this. Pull request. I'm a husband, a newish father. I have a 17-month-old daughter at home, but I'm not going to be one of those parents that's like, oh, let me put pictures of my kids in the slides. That's so cool. Oh, Emily, I just broadcast you and your grilled cheese to the world. That's strange. I'm going to hear about that when I get home. I'm also a home coffee roaster because when you work from home, you're a coffee snob, you realize like coffee is expensive. Anyway, we're not here to talk about coffee. We're here to talk about WP-CLI. How many people here have used WP-CLI before? Quick poll. Okay, so most of the room, most if not all. There may have been like one person who's on their phone. For those who aren't familiar, WP-CLI is WordPress on the command line. It's a way that we can talk to WordPress. We can work with WordPress without going through the typical WordPress admin interface. It's an extensible tool, meaning we can create new things. I can write a plugin and write a WP-CLI component for it. I can release new WP-CLI packages. I can do all sorts of cool stuff. And again, we're able to do this without using the standard WordPress GUI. Places where it's useful, if you're performing bulk operations, if you need to touch a lot of data at once, WP-CLI is going to be your best friend. It gives us better visibility into WordPress internals. There are a lot of things that out of the box, WordPress isn't going to tell us a lot about. What's going on in the cron? What transients exist? This lets us say, hey, WordPress, what's going on? WP-CLI is not subject to the timeouts that we would have in a browser. How many times have you written a big script or run an import or something, and after 30 seconds, it's like, oh, your script is timed out. Sorry, hope your data's not too corrupted. WP-CLI, because it's running using the PHP CLI server API, we're able to actually run these scripts indefinitely. PHP can run for a very, very long time. Gives us easier file system access if we have to work within the file system rather than going, well, does Nginx have access to this? We're able to say, no, we're working on the command line. This should be pretty easy for us. And because I'm lazy, I love the ability to script and automate all the things. Good places to use it. If you're deploying WordPress core updates, especially if you're doing it across multiple WordPress instances, you're not going, oh, let me go in, let me put it in maintenance mode, let me do it. You can just say, hey, update core or install core. We can manage our plugins and themes, whether we're installing, activating, removing, updating, all of that fun stuff. Because of that better insight we have, we can better troubleshoot issues that are going on. Because, no, we never have issues with WP cron. That would be silly. If you have scheduled maintenance routines, if you want to make sure, like, well, I'm backing up the database every day, or I'm going through and maybe cleaning up old post revisions, anything like that, WP-CLI, again, your best friend. And something we would do a lot of at 10up, data migrations and transformations. We have a client coming from platform A, moving on to WordPress. We have to take all of this data through a JSON API or even just from reading SQL and put it into WordPress. WP-CLI, fantastic for this. There's also this concept of YOLO scripts, and I call them YOLO scripts because sometimes when you say YOLO ironically too much, it just kind of becomes part of your vernacular, and then you hate yourself, but you wake up one day realizing, I'm a man who somewhat non-ironically says YOLO. But if a script is only meant to be once, it would be really silly to write an interface within WordPress to say, I need to go to this admin page and click this button to have it run a script. It's much less expensive, much less time consuming to write a script that says, I'm going to run this. I have to be on the server to do it, but that's fine because I'm an administrator and I have all the power. And then at the end, once the script is run, I can just simply throw it away. Some of the built-in commands, if you are new to WP-CLI, and I'll go through these quickly because it seems like most of the room is pretty familiar, we can do things with plugins and themes. So we could go, hey, I want to install Son of Clippy, which if you haven't used it, it's a fantastic plugin that brings Clippy to WordPress. Hashtag make WordPress Clippy again, as I spill water. We can update plugins as well. We can delete some themes, like, I don't really need Hello Dolly. Bye, Dolly. We can manage our users. We can create them. We can promote their roles. We can do all sorts of cool stuff. Importing and exporting, especially if you're moving platform to platform. Rather than going through the standard WordPress exporter and going, OK, I need my WXR, the Wixer file, and then import it, I can say, export these in maybe 5 megabyte chunks. If you've ever had to import content onto WordPress.com VIP, WP-CLI. Database operations. Because WordPress already knows how to talk to our database, we can perform a lot of the common database routines just through WP-CLI, rather than going, oh, I have to use MySQL in the command line, or SQL Workbench, or SQL Pro, or any of those applications. I can just say, hey, WP-DB export to this file name. I can import the database. I can optimize the database. All these great things that I can do via the command line. Search and replace, I want to call out particularly because this is amazing. So rather than doing a search and replace on like a SQL file and saying, okay, I'm going to find everything, and then my serialized data gets messed up because maybe I went from localhost to example.com, and then suddenly the serialized data is like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to throw stuff away. WP-CLI's search and replace is smart about serialization. It'll actually deserialize your data, then do the search and replace, then reserialize. So if you've migrated domain names before, if you've done anything where suddenly string lengths are changing, search and replace. Again, awesome. More stuff that we won't get into here. Operations related to cache, transients, cron. We can scaffold posts. We can manage our taxonomy terms. We can look at rewrites. There are even some scaffolding tools. A lot of cool stuff. I encourage you to check it out, wpcli.org/commands. But we're here to talk about writing our own commands. And before we can do that, we really need to understand what makes for a good WP-CLI command. I would encourage you, above all else, if you take nothing else away from this talk, remember your audience as you're building your CLI command. There are definitely cases where we're building a CLI command for our internal team. Maybe we need to have our hosting provider run something, or have our systems team run something if we don't have access as developers. But if we're distributing something with a plugin that maybe someone who's completely new to WP-CLI is working with, we want to make sure that we're giving them information that's not just a black box of, hey, run this command, and yep, something happened, good luck. There's a whole philosophy behind how WP-CLI is constructed, and this is another document I encourage you to read, wpcli.org/docs/philosophy. But a few of the salient points I want to highlight. One, don't assume anything. PHP is a very portable language. WordPress is a very portable platform. Your command, therefore, should be as portable as possible. Again, might not be as important if you know you're building it just for your one production server and you happen to be running a particular distribution with a particular stack. But these commands should be portable. If someone's downloading my plugin that happens to have a WP-CLI command, I shouldn't assume that they have ImageMagick installed. I shouldn't assume that they have GIFSICLE or any other library. If you're going to use third-party libraries, make sure that A, they're documented, and B, that you're checking that they actually exist, and that the versions match what you're looking for before executing something. Otherwise, people are just going to get this weird, like, oh, and now the command line died, and now I'm turned off WP-CLI forever. Thanks a lot. Next, composability. Always a good idea. How many people in the room know what composability is? All right, not many people. Yes, that means I get to teach you something. Composability is the idea that small commands can be chained together. The output from one can be passed into another. If you've worked with tools like Gulp, you may know this as streams. But this is the foundation that operating systems like Linux and thus Unix and thus Linux are built on, the idea of these small programs that we can chain together to accomplish awesome things. If you've heard the term pipeable, that refers to composability. Let's take a look at a very practical example. So with WP-CLI, we're saying WP post list, and I want to pipe this to grep. Grep lets me search a piece of content for a string. So I'm going to grep for hello, and I get this nice list that says, oh, hello world happens to be here. I'm able to filter that list because our commands are composable. Next, readability trumps the number of keystrokes. Make it obvious what the user is doing. I've seen far too many CLI commands where people go, oh, well, they can probably figure it out. So you end up with things like WP my command -- launch. Maybe it launches a process. Maybe it launches my site. No, oh, no, it's launching the nukes. I wish I had thought of that. Gee whiz. Next, stay focused. WP-CLI commands should be leveraging WordPress functionality. We're using this as an extension of WordPress, which means that anything we can do in WordPress, we can do via WP-CLI, rather than creating your own database abstraction layer or reinventing the way that posts are inserted into the database. We're still able to use things like WPDB. We're still able to use WP query, term queries, the plugin API, all of these great things that make WordPress development fun, we can do on the command line. Meanwhile, if the command you're writing is not really related to WordPress, I need to write a WP-CLI command to, talk to my Laravel app to update some content, maybe WP-CLI isn't the right solution. We do have this library maintained by the WP-CLI team, available at github.com/WP-CLI/PHP-CLI tools. This is some of the underlying code from WP-CLI, but it does not have WordPress dependencies. So if you're like, I really like the way WP-CLI is able to handle input and output, but I'm doing something completely unrelated to WordPress, check out this library. You can load it as a composer dependency, and it's fantastic. So now let's get into writing commands. Now that you understand the philosophy, what we're kind of looking for, let's see what it takes to build our own, shall we? The basic structure of a WP-CLI command, you're creating a class, and it's going to extend the WP-CLI command class. This is kind of our base underlying structure. And then we use the static method of add command on the WP-CLI class to register it. So in this case, we're creating my awesome command, which extends WP-CLI command, and we're registering it under the name of awesome. So we say awesome refers to my awesome command, which happens to be this. Now we can run our command by saying WP awesome. Within the class itself, we're going to have one or more public methods, and each method corresponds to a subcommand within our awesome command. In this case, we have convert terms. Convert terms is going to convert terms from taxonomy A to taxonomy B. Wanted a nice trivial example. We'd run this by saying WP awesome convert _ terms. Now you'll notice I said that was a public method. We can still write private methods. We're still writing object-oriented PHP here. The public methods are automatically going to be exposed to WP-CLI. If we say WP-CLI awesome some private method that we happen to have marked public, suddenly we might have unintended results because people are running commands that aren't meant to be run directly. So our simple or our typical object-oriented principles are going to apply here. If it's something that's meant to be part of the public API, it should be marked public. Otherwise, it should be marked protected or private. But it's still a useful idea to leverage these protected or private methods, because if we have 3 commands that are doing very similar things and we can localize that functionality to one method, and we can say, okay, we run this, and it's calling this method, but this method is also calling this method, we're able to have smaller, easier to follow, drier WP-CLI commands. So as we break down how each method is built out, it begins with a doc block. And it's not just because I'm really kind of obsessive about documentation, but the doc block has a lot of power within WP-CLI. The doc block is going to contain a short description, options, examples, doc block tags, and all these together allow WP-CLI to automatically generate help documentation. And you'll see an example of that in a second. Starting with the short description, this is going to be just a brief description of, hey, this is what the command does. Because usually that's a good idea if you're presenting commands, especially if they can accidentally launch nukes. So in our case, we have convert terms from taxonomy A to taxonomy B. The options are going to be the arguments and options accepted by the command. In our case, we're going to have an origin taxonomy and a destination taxonomy. We convert from A to B. The examples, this is going to give people a sense of how they might use the command. In our case, WP awesome convert dash terms, category post tag. We're converting categories to post tags. Pretty straightforward, yes? The tags allow us to modify the behavior of our command. The synopsis is going to let us automatically validate the arguments. We can say, no, these are required arguments, these are optional arguments, these are treated as associative arguments, so options rather than positional arguments. Subcommand lets us change the name that it's referenced under. You may remember our public method was convert underscore terms. This lets us do things like, I want you to be convert dash terms, because I prefer dashes over underscores when I'm on the command line. We can create aliases. So if we want to have that launch nukes available at launch, we can. I would still encourage you to be verbose, but sometimes your systems engineers will be like, thank you so much for saving me keystrokes. Let the canonical name, the subcommand, or the method name itself kind of guide this, but the alias can be a useful tag that I wanted you to be aware of. So it may look something like this. Our synopsis, we have the origin and destination. They're both listed as required, and I'll show you the syntax for these momentarily. Our subcommands, we want to make it convert dash terms, and maybe we also want to have it available at do conversion, which you may notice, thanks to monospace font, saves you exactly 0 characters. The help documentation that I mentioned earlier, thanks to the doc block that we wrote, WP-CLI is able to automatically generate this documentation. If someone runs WP awesome convert terms dash dash help, they get this that tells us exactly the name of the command, what it does, how it works, the available options with explanations of what they are, and example usage. Super helpful, especially if you've ever worked with someone who tried to build a PHP CLI command but didn't really know what they were doing, and it just turned into this hope and pray. I prefer to not hope and pray when it comes to my data. Maybe that's just me. Now, let's talk about input and output, because at its core, that's what a program is supposed to do, right? It takes input, produces output. There are multiple ways to accept arguments and types of arguments that we can pass. So we start with our positional arguments. These are, WP awesome, convert terms, origin, destination, where the position of them matter. So we can either define them as required, or we can wrap them in square brackets, or square brackets, to make them optional. Likewise, we have options, so associative arguments, where we have this dash dash option. This is required. Again, the square brackets make it optional. We also have the ability to do flags. Flags are treated just like the associative arguments, but they're treated as a Boolean. So if it exists, it's true. Otherwise, it's false. And then when we get into our method itself, we have args, which refer to our positional arguments, and associative args, which are our associative arguments. Within the function itself, within the method, we're in an object-oriented context. We may do things like, if this set associative args option 2, then do something, and we can write these conditionals. I'll show you some cooler ways to handle this in a moment. As far as confirmation, besides just accepting arguments, we can be more interactive with the user. We can ask them for confirmation. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes or no? Thanks to the CLI, WP-CLI confirm method. We can produce a prompt. We can say, please enter your email address. Perhaps even give them a default email address. And if they hit enter, we'd get user@example.com. If they fill it out, we have that value. Then we can have that available to us in that email variable. If we want to do a menu, we're able to do that through WP-CLI. Pick between foobar and baz, what to do? And we get this nice little menu. Those are just some of the basics of input. When it comes to the output, there are 4 major methods that you're going to find yourself using a lot. Log, which is printing a line to the CLI output, and then warn, error, and success. Each of these correspond to different states within our within our application. A warning you're going to use to obviously say, hey, something's up, maybe pay attention here. An error is also going to preface it with a big red error, and it's going to exit with a status code of 1. If you've dealt with a CLI before and you know different status codes, 0 means like, yep, everything's cool, nothing to worry about. Status code 1 means like, oh, I'm not going to, like if you're chaining stuff in that, because we're composable, right? It's not going to continue because clearly something went wrong. We also have success, because it's always nice to tell people when they didn't break things. I can tell you as a developer, I really appreciate knowing when I don't screw things up. We also have some more advanced output options. If we want to do tables, we can say, these are the available table or headers, and these are our rows, and output it, and we get this nice ASCII table. Now, you may be thinking, well, an ASCII table, while it looks nice on the command line, isn't exactly useful in the whole rule of composability, right? Because if we pipe this somewhere and we grep for like a pipe character, we're going to get literally every line. Fortunately, the output changes if you pipe this anywhere. So say we want to use the redirect operator and send this to a CSV file. It'll automatically treat this as a tab-separated list. So then we can take our nice table on the command line, but because we piped it somewhere, we can say, I can import this into a spreadsheet. I can more easily run this through grep or any other program. I can take the arguments from this and use xargs to pass them to other commands. There are a lot of things you can do, but we have this nice helper to get a nicer format. There are other formats available. Using the more generic format items beyond tables, we can also do things like, I need to generate YAML, I need JSON. We can extend it to create other output formats. It's just a really good tool. If you're doing long-running operations, it can be really helpful to have progress indicators. Show people, yes, this is still working. By creating a progress bar here, we say it's going to be 10 steps. This might be we're processing 10 posts. You can see we're not really doing anything. We're just sleeping for a second. But then we tick the progress bar, and after 10 seconds, we get something that looks like this. This will just continue to increment with each passing second, so people know, hey, this has worked out. And because we're working in PHP, don't forget other more typical output methods or ways to track errors, like error log. If I'm running a long-running script or a maintenance routine or something, and I want to make sure that if something goes wrong, I have history of that, I can use error log, just like I would within PHP, because, hey, it is PHP, so that I can keep track of what's going on in my command. So let's get into some more good ideas. When building your commands, you may find it useful to put something like a dry run flag, especially if you're doing something destructive, if you're mutating data in any way, if you're making changes that would persist beyond just running it. The ability to say -- dry run, so people can run a command, see what the output would be like, but not actually mutate the data. Alternately, you may prefer more of a -- live approach, where unless that live flag is there, nothing is actually going to change in the database. This really helps people like me not screw up your databases, because no, I've never done that. Verbosity, again, this comes down to knowing your audience. Saying -- verbose, perhaps we're doing a migration script and we want to like have a lot of information, but we don't want like so much information, like grabbed this image from this URL, imported it into this post, added these tags. That might be a little more verbose than most people are looking for. Sometimes that's helpful though. So if we can say, if you want it to be more verbose in the output, pass -- verbose, and suddenly we can have more explicit output, we can do that. Likewise, or conversely, we could do a -- quiet. This is a convention of, hey, don't tell me anything about it unless something goes wrong. Maybe I'm running this command on a cron script, and any output that comes from it is going to get emailed, and I'm going to log in, and it'll be like, you have new mail. And I'm like, I don't care about this mail. So the ability to control the level of verbosity of the output can be extremely helpful. If you are a plugin author, you may find it beneficial to create a WP-CLI component within your plugin. And there's a nice little pattern for including the functionality, because you don't always want the WP-CLI command subclass to be available. We have this constant WP_CLI. So if it's defined and if it's just truthy, then we'll load our myCLI class. This helps us make sure that if someone's in an environment where they're not running WP-CLI, we don't have to worry about like, oh, well, WP-CLI is not defined, and we have all these issues. And we can just kind of be like, if it's there, cool, use it. Otherwise, don't worry about it. Good example of this, I have a plugin in the repo called Revision Strike that goes through and cleans up old post revisions. I wrote a WP-CLI add-on for it because I wanted to make sure that if someone had my plugin installed and activated, if they wanted to go in and manually clean out some post revisions, they could do that. The file is included in just this way, but if you're using Revision Strike and not using WP-CLI, you're not loading anything, you don't have to worry about anything. Keep in mind you also have access to the WordPress plugin API. If you've constructed your plugins well, or your theme, or anything else, you can still apply filters, you can still do actions, you can still add actions and filters to things. So in the case of Revision Strike, that WP-CLI command literally executed an action that was like Revision Strike execute. And then my plugin was able to go, hey, something just fired, Revision Strike execute. I should go ahead and do my thing. I'm not re-implementing my whole plugin. I'm leveraging the existing code, just making it available via the command line. Another way to handle arguments, and staying on the topic of use what's already available to you through WordPress, WP parse args can make it extremely helpful when you're handling a lot of different arguments. Rather than all those if-is-set checks that we were doing before, we can just kind of say, okay, here are my associative args, and here are what I want my defaults to be. Let WP parse args already go ahead and merge it, so I don't have to worry if the user doesn't pass foo or doesn't pass bar because I have defaults set. Makes your code much cleaner, makes it much easier to see kind of the default state of everything. Few performance tips. Caching is always a fun challenge. Try to be very obvious about what you're caching. If you're running, I want to get a list of all terms. Great. Try not to do that like on every iteration, especially if you're going through like 100,000 posts, because then you're just needlessly running this over and over. Cache it in a local variable outside of the loop. But at the same time, be very careful about what exists in the cache. WordPress has a lot of caching mechanisms that like to kind of say, oh, I'm just going to build up over time. Each time you run something, I'm going to add a new entry to this array. When you're just working in kind of typical single request WordPress, that's usually not a big deal. If you're running this hundreds of thousands of times, doing some giant migration, suddenly you will burn your server down. I can tell you that there are some systems people at 10up that I got a bit of a reputation with when I was working on a giant migration. I don't think any of them are here, which is good because I would be getting egged at this moment. WP importing, very useful constant. Not many people seem to know about it, but if you're doing giant bulk operations on content, it can be really helpful to say, hey, WP importing, define it as true. WordPress has some checks built into core to say, if WP importing is true, don't try to ping sites that have been linked to from a post, or any of those kind of things. It helps us kind of say, no, WordPress, we're doing a lot of stuff. Don't try to have all the little side effects. Save queries, another useful constant. If you're debugging something and you want to say, well, what query is actually being executed here, WP query will try to log, these are the queries that have been run. This is another place where I have burned a server down because it's activated by default on VIP Quick Start. So I was doing this migration to WordPress.com VIP, several hundred thousands of posts, and suddenly like the WP query object was just getting huge because it's saving every query that's running. So be aware of this constant, use it when it's helpful, and turn it off when it's not. Garbage collection, something that as PHP developers, we're probably not having to worry about because typically you make a request to the server goes, okay, here you go, and then the process is like, I can just be cleaned up now, I'm done. Meanwhile, when you're running these long-running processes, suddenly garbage collector isn't able to do its job as effectively. So we want to help it out. We want to say, I'm done with this instance of an object, so I'm going to go ahead and unset it. That signals to the garbage collector, hey, you can free up this memory so it can be allocated elsewhere. Likewise, occasionally clearing out some of the global variables. You know, these things that keep growing, if we don't need them to continue growing forever, we don't have to clear them every iteration, but maybe every, like, hey, I just managed 1,000 posts. Maybe it's time to just empty that out, free up some memory. There are also methods that you may see in some major CLI commands that are named stop the insanity or similar. This particular example is from WordPress.com VIP, but the idea is, hey, let's go through WPDB, WP object cache, some of these global variables that stuff just kind of gets thrown in, and we'll just clear that out. You may cost yourself a little bit of time as those end up being rebuilt, but you're also not just hoarding data and exhausting the memory on your system. A few more things in the last 5 minutes that I have. Bash completion, not installed by default, but it is available at WP-CLI.org. If you're using WP-CLI on even a semi-regular basis, highly recommend having bash completion for it. If you're working in WordPress multi-site, make sure that you are aware of what site you're modifying. There's this -- URL option that we can pass. So we can say WP cache empty, it's going to run on the default site and multi-site. If we need it to be subsite.example.com, we want to make sure that we pass -- URL so that WP-CLI understands what site you're trying to work on. There are a few useful global options available. User, we can say, okay, great, I want to create these posts, and I want to create them as though I'm operating as this user. We can do that using the -- user. -- will make sure it's exposing all of the PHP errors. Normally WP-CLI, because people aren't always like, hey, I'm so glad I have this strict standards issue because of some third-party plugin. WP-CLI will silence a lot of that by default, but the -- debug will help let you see exactly what's going on under the hood. There's also this beautiful -- prompt option or flag that basically says, hey, command line is hard, let's be honest. I mean, people can fill out a form, but remembering all of the options, especially with more complex commands, this can be a real pain. So we can take that pain away by saying, run it with -- prompt, and suddenly WP-CLI, because it understands, okay, this argument has this, because we're defining our doc blocks, because we're not savages, WP-CLI is able to walk people through it. Okay, we have our WP awesome convert terms. What's the origin taxonomy? What's the destination taxonomy? And people can enter those in a prompt rather than having to remember the context of a giant string. Next, be very careful if you're using die or exit in your scripts, because this is going to kill the entire WP-CLI process. If in doubt, return early from your WP-CLI command. That lets WP-CLI still like tear everything down and make sure that your server is not just like, oh, we have these things running out there that just kind of died mid-process. So if in doubt, return early over exit or die. And then finally, because composability is amazing, WP-CLI allows us to invoke other WP-CLI commands from within WP-CLI. So we can do WP-CLI launch and launch another command in a separate process. Likewise, we could say launch self and run it in the same process, get the output from it, and then use that within our script. So if you need to get a post list, you could use WP post list, something that's built into WP-CLI, to get that list of posts rather than writing your own implementation of WP post list. You can reuse what's already available to you and focus just on your core application logic. And that is my time. So thank you all so much.